Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the QUT Faculty of Law, to our symposium on copyright law and the creative industries. The purpose of this event is to bring together creative practitioners, cultural, institutional representatives and legal academics and lawyers to discuss the intersection between copyright law, creativity and culture. As is always the case at QUT, in keeping with the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where QUT now stands and recognise that these have always been places of teaching and learning. We wish to pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play within the QUT community. I'd like to introduce QUT's poets, Associate Professor Sarah Holland-Batt and Dr. Ella Jeffery, who are going to provide a literary perspective on copyright today, talking about covert and overt plagiarism on poetry and theft.
In 1920, T.S. Eliot delivered an axiomatic pronouncement, which has shaped how most poets have thought about poetry and originality for the last century. Immature poets imitate, mature poets steal, Eliot wrote in The Sacred Wood. Bad poets deface what they take, and good poets make it into something better, or at least something different. 100 years on, this paper returns to Eliot's dictum to evaluate current thinking about poetry and theft in the literary field, focusing on the recent case studies of uncreative writing, wherein theft is overt and central to the poet's creative enterprise, as well as recent poetry plagiarism scandals, wherein the theft is covert and concealed. In doing so, we seek to define and make explicit the often tacit conventions in contemporary literary practice relating to theft from the perspective of the poet-practitioner. Much thought has been given to defining the transgressive nature of plagiarism, described alternately as theft, impersonation, piracy, perversion or sickness, appropriation, and even sin, as well as the plagiarist's psychopathology and the injuries the plagiarist does to the writer whose works are stolen. Kevin Young argues that the act of plagiarism is linked both to privilege and power, and that the plagiarist is driven by a wish to belong, even while confusing this wish with another's belongings. The effect on writers whose works are plagiarised, Young writes, is both personal and despairingly impersonal, as the plagiarist appropriates not only their words, but their own subjective experiences and life. Justin Clemens speculates that plagiarists may be driven by a variety of motives: a perverse wish to get caught, a wish to hurt those whose words you steal, or the rare case of a genuinely subconscious plagiarism in which the plagiarist is captured, literally, by the words he or she seeks to steal. Clemens, Miller and others have remarked on the plagiarist's uncanny ability to emulate middle-brow literary tastes, often achieving success in literary prizes which, when exposed, lay bare the supposed hollowness of literary culture, and at times even destabilise faith in it. In an Australian context, this claim is substantiated by the infamous example of Ern Malley, an invention of poets James Macaulay and Harold Stewart, whose hoax poems, plagiarised from a report on the breeding grounds of mosquitoes, Shakespeare, the dictionary and other sources, irrevocably damaged the cause of modernism in Australia. While much thought has been given to the plagiarist's crimes, motives and effect, less thought has been given to the tacit conventions regarding poetry and theft that are mutually agreed upon by poets and among poets, which we seek to catalogue and interrogate today. Perhaps the most overt form of contemporary poetic theft occurs in the erasure poem, a form which depends on a pre-existing text written by another author for the sum total of its meaning. The erasurist deletes, blacks out, collages over an unwanted text, leaving a poem in its place, in which the words appear in the same original order and spatial arrangement as in the original. Often obscure literary texts form the source material. The poet Tom Phillips used an arcane Victorian novel, W.H. Mallock's A Human Document, to create the first known work of erasure poetry, a humulament. Other poets use well-known works. Ronald Johnson erased Milton's Paradise Lost to create his radios. Jen Bervin used Shakespeare's sonnets as fodder for nets, and Janet Holmes uses Emily Dickinson's poems in The Manuscript of My Kin. Others use deliberately unpoetic texts. In the book Zong, M. Sorbsey Williams draws on legal decision, Gregson versus Gilbert, related to the 1781 mass drowning of African slaves on the slave ship Zong. And while erasure poems clearly challenge the bounds of poetic originality, their objective generally is not to summarise or affirm the source text, but rather to write against the grain of it, creating poetry that is often dissonant in tone and content from its source. They also clearly signal their unoriginality and indebtedness to the original through the space left by the erasure, which functions as a visual record of what has been removed. Consequently, the general consensus among poets appears to be, as Jeannie Vanasco has argued, that to erase is to write. Another form of overt poetic theft occurs in the cento, a form forged entirely from lines by other poets. The first known cento was composed in the 3rd century CE by Hosidius Gaeta, a playwright who borrowed lines from Virgil to construct his tragedy Medea. Contemporary Australian poets, including Toby Fitch and Stuart Barnes, write centos drawn from sources including poems by Gig Ryan, Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, Thomas Wyatt and Gwen Harwood. Central to the cento is the act of making attributions clear through epigraphs, notes and titular references, or in some instances relying on the recognisability of the lines to function as an inference of attribution. Centos are a precursor to what is now known as found poetry, a form invented by the Dadaists and Surrealists in order, in part, to release the poet from the myth of the individual genius. Contemporary found poetry draws on distinctly unpoetic texts, legal and historical documents, reality TV transcripts, among others, often announcing its unoriginal nature through its use of an unpoetic register. Found poetry has been championed most prominently by the American conceptual poet Kenneth Goldsmith, whose school of uncreative writing eschews originality and conceives poetic authorship as an act of curation or transcription rather than ideation and imagination. Goldsmith's oeuvre includes books comprising transcribed radio commentary about baseball, weather reports, and Manhattan traffic updates. He proudly declares that his poems are unreadable and that the poem resides in the concept rather than the text. Such an approach is not without controversy. Goldsmith attracted significant opprobrium for appropriating the autopsy report of Michael Brown, an 18-year-old African-American victim of police violence in Ferguson, Missouri, and reading it as a poem at Brown University, in line with other works he has authored in 7 American Deaths and Disasters, a book which includes transcriptions of reportage about 9/11 and JFK's assassination. In addition to being criticised as racist and perpetuating white dominance and ownership of black bodies, Goldsmith was especially criticised for altering elements of the autopsy report for poetic effect. In this instance, the lack of fidelity to the original document compounded criticism of the poet's actions in adopting the text as his own supposedly authored work. Another variant of found poetry occurs in the archival poem, one which draws on existing historical texts and repurposes them as poetry. In the recent collection Archival Poetics, Natalie Harkin draws upon colonial archival materials, including family records, about the removal of Indigenous girls into indentured domestic servitude, making overt reference to the record's provenance in notes and epigraphs. Similarly, Lisa Gorton recently published a long archival poem, Royal Park, which extensively quotes archival records about Melbourne's Royal Park, and Gorton documents her sources exhaustively in the notes section of her book. There are more subtle forms yet of poetic theft. It's common for poets to riff on, borrow or use a single line as a springboard for their poem. The customary method of attribution for such instances is either through an epigraph with wording to the effect that the poem is after the work of another, through a note at the end of the book, or in some instances through italicisation of the phrase itself, which visually signifies that its origin lies elsewhere. And now I'll hand over to my colleague, Dr. Ella Jeffery.
Thanks, Sarah. Accompanying these forms of overt theft, which are broadly agreed not to constitute malicious plagiarism among poets, there are deliberate instances of plagiarism where the attempt is made to conceal the theft. One high-profile case involves Pierre Desruisseaux, a recent Canadian poet laureate whose work Tranche de Vie included a patchwork of unacknowledged and carefully altered lines from celebrated and amateur poets. A similar claim was levelled at Australian poet Andrew Slattery in 2013, who, after winning a series of prestigious prizes, was revealed to have plagiarised his poems by patching together unattributed lines from around 50 other poets, including Sylvia Plath and Seamus Heaney. Both poets concealed their sources by incorporating multiple references from different poems to create a patchwork effect, disguising the original context of the lines by combining different lines and phrases. Other poets plagiarise a poem's entire framework while marginally masking the subject matter or the location of the poems, as was the case for British poet Christian Ward and Australian poet Graham Nunn. Both were exposed by self-described poetry plagiarism hunter Ira Lightman. Ward's and Nunn's scaffolded plagiarisms retained whole sections of the poems they plagiarised, preserving their rhetorical structures. These poems are more readily identifiable as plagiarisms when placed beside the original poem, as you can see on screen here. Nunn's poem Platypus seeks to keep the rhetorical power of the Helen Dunmore poem Heron. He changes key nouns and verbs as well as the animal the poem describes, but overall retains Dunmore's sentence structure, its lineation, and the poem's mood and movement. Other poets make minor substitutions of individual words and phrases to change the overall meaning of a line or stanza. Two prominent examples include American poet Eliot O'Toole, whose poem Gunmetal was nominated for a prestigious prize before it was revealed as largely plagiarised, and British poet Cherie Mack, whose book Laventille includes many plagiarised poems. O'Toole made minor substitutions to the poems she stole, changing words and phrases to disguise their origin. But she went one step further and had lines from a plagiarised poem tattooed on her arm, which, when she posted a picture of the tattoo to Twitter, exposed her theft. One crucial element of O'Toole's plagiarism is her appropriation not only of lines from the poem, but also the poet's experiences. O'Toole plagiarised the poet Rachel McKibbin's, whose original poem recounted her experience of trauma and domestic violence. McKibbin's line, "Hell-spangled girl spitting teeth in the sink," is a literal reference to the traumatic loss of her teeth as a result of violence. But O'Toole renders this as metaphor in her lines, "Ramshackle girl spitting teeth in the sink," misinterpreting lived experience as figurative. British poet Cherie Mack's second book, Laventille, set in Trinidad and Tobago, contained a slew of plagiarised poems in which Mack changed nouns and verbs and altered syntax to mask the source. We can see this in her lines from The Men of Success Village, which read, "You hear their footsteps, the tinkling of bottles, sudden blasts of calypso music, whining of dirty muss." These lines are plagiarised from Duncan Dunn's poem, The Men of Terry Street, set in Hull, England, in which the poet writes, "I hear their footsteps, the ticking of bicycle chains, sudden blasts of motorcycles, whimpering of vans." Questions have also been raised about Mack's use of poems written by English poets about English locations to shape her poems about Trinidad. As Kay Miller asks, is it that Mack does not know the Caribbean well enough or cannot imagine it sufficiently that she has to lean on these other evocations of distant places? Miller describes Mack's plagiarism as, quote, euphemism. He points to her tendency to replace one term with a closely corresponding term, changing Jim Harrison's lines, "It was May, a time of lilacs and shooting stars," to "It was March, a time of blossom and shooting stars." And Judy Jordan's "She bared her stomach to the full moon to ensure a girl this time," to the lines, "She bared her stomach to the full moon to ensure that it was a boy this time." In that last example, Mack also uses a change in line break to further disguise the resemblance to the original poem. Often, sense is sacrificed in this euphemistic approach. Harrison's line, "Death waits inside us for a door to open," makes less sense in Mack's plagiarized reworking of the line, which reads, "Rain waits inside us for a door to open." Other instances of plagiarism in poetry are less clear-cut, especially when the originality of the source poem is itself debatable. Viral Canadian Insta poet Rupi Kaur was accused by the poet Nayira Waheed of, quote, "plagiarism, paraphrasing, and hypersimilarity," in relation to Waheed's own work posted on Tumblr. Kaur's case is complicated because both Kaur and Waheed are practitioners of a naturalistic and often cliché form of poetry, making the originality difficult to discern. Kaur's nonchalant defense after the story was picked up by a series of major news outlets suggested she was largely unconcerned by the claim, and she has notably escaped the ramifications felt by other plagiarists. This may be because Kaur's audience differs to that of most poets. Her readers are overwhelmingly adolescents who may not care about plagiarism or appreciate its import. They may also have a different relationship to copying and reduplication as digital natives fully conversant with platforms that encourage such practices. Waheed's claims have largely failed to dim Kaur's popularity, unlike plagiarists such as O'Toole, Ward, Nunn, and Slattery, who have ceased publishing poetry after being exposed. Each of them, however, has attempted to address accusations and defend their poetic practice. Ward claimed that he had employed other poets' work as a frame to construct a new poem, but had unintentionally submitted an early draft which contained overwhelming similarities to the original. Accidents are a common theme in poets' statements addressing accusations of plagiarism. Nunn also mentioned the inspiration he drew from other artistic works, suggesting that, quote, "the framework of the poem is used to tell my own story, and parts of the original text are creatively appropriated in the formation of a new work," unquote. And that, in the course of being inspired, he failed to record the texts he drew on. O'Toole similarly claimed that she intentionally paraphrased other poets and simply forgot to acknowledge that she had done so. Slattery, when his bricolaged poems were discovered, invoked what is known as the cento defense, claiming that his work was an intentional collage of other poets' work. The cento defense is rarely persuasive, particularly because the cento form has historically included clear attribution of its sources. As Clemens notes, in reaching for a defense based on tradition, it seems that the plagiarists don't know anything about the tradition upon which they're supposedly relying. These excuses are mostly, as Kay Miller says, worth a hearty guffaw, and do little to convince other poets, publishers, or critics. While apologies and explanations are often forthcoming, admissions of plagiarism are less so, even when, as in Mack and Nunn's cases, the evidence is stark. Ultimately, poetry functions as a self-regulating system in relation to plagiarism, with poets themselves most often the detectors and arbiters of acceptable and unacceptable theft. Most poets know and understand the tacit conventions that we have made explicit in this paper in relation to the works of others, which is why claims by plagiarists of insufficient record keeping or memory lapses are rarely given credence by their peers. While Eliot's dictum about strong poets stealing and weak poets borrowing endures, as new forms of uncreative writing emerge, new modes of theft and attribution will likely develop. We hold that poets will enforce whatever conventions emerge from such new forms alongside those we have outlined, with poetic consensus remaining the predominating way that plagiarism is understood, detected, and policed. Thank you.